Sometimes, the smallest choice you make when no one is watching is the one that changes everything. The rain falls in a steady rhythm against the city sidewalks, soft but relentless, turning the streets of downtown Chicago into a blur of reflections and hurried footsteps. And somewhere between the glow of a flickering street lamp and the hum of passing cars, Sophie Carter pulls her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders, her sneakers soaked through, each step a quiet reminder that she has nowhere to go tonight. Not anymore. Not after the landlord's final warning, not after the door closed. Behind her with that hollow, final click, and she exhales slowly, watching her breath disappear into the cold air as she keeps walking, because stopping would mean thinking, and thinking would mean feeling, and she cannot afford that right now. Not when her phone is nearly dead, her bank account hovering just above zero, and her entire life packed into a single worn backpack slung over her shoulder. And then it happens. Just a few feet ahead of her, a man in a dark coat steps off the curb. Distracted, one hand pressed to his ear as if caught in a conversation he cannot escape, and something slips from his coat pocket, barely noticeable, a soft thud against the wet pavement. And he keeps walking, unaware, blending into the crowd, disappearing into the rhythm of the city like he was never there at all. But Sophie sees it. She always notices the small things, maybe because she has spent her whole life surviving on them. And she slows, her eyes locking onto the object resting near the curb, a leather wallet, dark, worn but expensive in a way that doesn't scream but whispers. And for a moment, everything else fades. The rain, the noise, the cold, all of it replaced by a single, quiet thought that settles deep in her chest. She could just take it. No one saw, no one would know, and God knows she needs it. She needs something, anything, because tonight she doesn't even have enough for a warm meal. And the idea lingers longer than she wants to admit, her fingers curling, slightly as if already reaching for it. But then she hesitates, her gaze drifting back toward the direction the man walked, and something inside her tightens, something stubborn, something unbreakable, the part of her that still believes in doing the right thing even when it costs her everything. And with a sharp inhale, she bends down, picks up the wallet, the leather cool and heavy in her hands, and without giving herself another second to think, she turns and runs, weaving through people, her heart pounding louder than the rain as she calls out, "Hey, sir, you dropped this." But her voice nearly disappears into the city noise, and she pushes harder, faster, her breath catching as she closes the distance, until finally, just before he reaches the corner, she reaches out and lightly grabs his sleeve, and he turns, surprised, his expression guarded at first, eyes sharp and unreadable, and for a brief second, they just look at each other. Two strangers caught in a moment neither of them expected, rain dripping from her hair, his coat speckled with water, the world moving around them while time seems to pause, and Sophie swallows, holding out the wallet with a small, breathless smile. "You dropped this," she says, simple, steady, like it wasn't the hardest decision she's made all week. And he looks at the wallet, then back at her, something shifting behind his eyes, something curious, something she can't quite place. And as he takes it from her hand, his fingers brushing hers just for a second, he studies her a little longer than necessary, like he's trying to understand something that doesn't quite make sense. And Sophie feels that familiar discomfort creep in, the awareness of her damp clothes, her worn shoes, the invisible line that separates people like him from people like her, and she starts to step back, already ready to disappear into the night again. But then he speaks, his voice calm, measured. "You could have kept it," he says, not accusing, just stating a fact, and Sophie shrugs lightly, a faint smile, tugging at her lips despite everything. "Yeah," she replies, her voice soft but certain, "but it wasn't mine." And for a moment, neither of them moves, the rain continuing to fall around them, and something about that answer, simple as it is, lands heavier than either of them expects, though only one of them truly understands why. The man does not look away right away, not after her answer, not after the way she says it like it is the most obvious thing in the world, and Sophie shifts her weight slightly, her fingers tightening around the strap of her backpack as the cold begins to creep back into her awareness, reminding her that she has already given more time to this moment than she can afford. But then he exhales softly, almost like he has just come to a quiet decision, and a faint, unexpected smile touches his lips. "Thank you," he says, his voice lower now, more sincere. And there is something about the way he says it that makes it feel heavier than a simple courtesy, like it carries weight from somewhere deeper, and Sophie nods quickly, brushing a strand of damp hair behind her ear. "No problem," she replies, already taking a small step backward, ready to disappear again. But before she can turn, he adds, "Wait," and she pauses, hesitating for just a second before looking back at him, cautious but curious, and he glances down at the wallet in his hand, then back at her, studying her again as if trying to understand the story written between the lines of her tired eyes and soaked clothes. "Let me at least buy you a coffee," he says, simple, straightforward, but something in his tone suggests that it is not just about gratitude, and Sophie almost says no, the word forming instinctively because accepting things from strangers is not something she is used to, not something she trusts easily. But then a gust of cold wind cuts through her jacket, sharp enough to make her shiver, and her stomach twists in quiet protest, reminding her that she has not eaten since early afternoon, and she hesitates, caught between pride and practicality, before letting out a small breath. "Just coffee," she says, her voice careful, like she is setting a boundary she is not entirely sure she can enforce, and he nods once, as if he understands more than she is saying, and together they step into the nearest cafe, the bell above the door chiming softly as warmth immediately wraps around them, a sharp contrast to the cold outside, and Sophie feels her shoulders relax just a little, the scent of coffee and baked bread filling the air, grounding her in a way she did not realize she needed. And they find a small table by the window, droplets of rain tracing quiet paths down the glass beside them. And as he orders 2 coffees without hesitation, Sophie watches him carefully, noting the subtle details, the way he carries himself, the calm confidence that does not try to prove anything, the kind that comes from being used to control, and when he returns with the cups, sliding one toward her, she murmurs a quiet thank you, wrapping her hands around the warmth like it is something fragile she needs to protect. And for a moment, neither of them speaks, the silence not uncomfortable, but not entirely easy either, until he finally breaks it. "You said it was not yours," he says, leaning back slightly, his gaze steady but not intrusive. "Do you always live like that?" And Sophie lets out a small, almost amused breath, shaking her head, as she looks down at the surface of her coffee. "I try to," she admits, her voice softer now, more honest than she expected to be. "Does not mean it is always easy." And he studies her for a second longer, something thoughtful flickering in his expression, like he is filing that answer away somewhere important, and then he asks, "What is your name?" And she hesitates just long enough for it to matter, not because she does not want to tell him, but because giving your name feels like giving a piece of yourself, and she has learned to be careful with that. But finally she says, "Sophie," and he nods slowly, repeating it once under his breath like he wants to remember it, "Sophie," before offering his own, "Ethan," simple, unadorned, nothing that hints at anything beyond the man sitting across from her, and Sophie nods, unaware that the name carries far more weight in other rooms, in other worlds she has never stepped into. And as the rain continues to fall outside, something shifts, quietly between them, something neither of them fully understands yet, but something that feels like the beginning of a story neither of them saw coming. The warmth of the cafe lingers, but it does not erase the quiet weight Sophie carries. It only softens the edges for a little while. And as she takes another careful sip of her coffee, she becomes more aware of the man sitting across from her, of Ethan, the way he watches without staring, listens without interrupting, and it unsettles her slightly because she is not used to being seen in that way, not without judgment, not without expectation, and she shifts in her seat, glancing toward the window where the rain continues to blur the city, lights into something almost dreamlike. "So what do you do, Ethan?" she asks finally, her tone light but curious, and he pauses for just a fraction of a second, not long enough for most people to notice, but Sophie does, because she has learned to read hesitation like a language, and he leans back slightly, fingers resting loosely around his cup. "I work with companies," he says, vague but smooth, like it is an answer he has given before, and Sophie raises an eyebrow, a small smile forming, despite herself. That sounds like a very careful way of not answering the question. she replies, and for the first time, a quiet laugh escapes him, low and genuine, and it changes something about the air between them, makes it feel less like a coincidence and more like a connection. Fair enough, he says, tilting his head slightly. Let us just say I help make decisions. And Sophie nods slowly, accepting the answer even if it tells her very little, because she understands that sometimes people carry things they are not ready to explain, and she is not the kind of person who pushes, not when she barely knows him, and not when she has her own walls firmly in place, and the conversation drifts naturally from there. Small things at first, where she works, how long she has been in the city, the kind of questions people ask when they are trying to build something without breaking it. And Sophie finds herself answering more honestly than she expected, telling him about the diner too. Blocks from the river where she works double shifts, about the way she sketches in a small notebook during her breaks, about how she once thought she would have her own art studio by now, and she laughs softly. When she says it, like it is a dream she has already packed away, and Ethan listens to every word, not just hearing but absorbing, his expression thoughtful, almost troubled for a moment when she mentions sleeping on a friend's couch, though she does not elaborate on how temporary that arrangement has become, and then his gaze flickers briefly to the wallet resting beside his hand on the table, his fingers brushing over it absent-mindedly, and something shifts in his posture, subtle but deliberate, as if he is remembering something important, something tied to that small piece of leather. And Sophie notices, of course she does, because she notices everything, and she tilts her head slightly. You seem pretty calm for someone who almost lost something important, she says, her tone curious but not accusatory, and he looks up at her, meeting her eyes with a steady gaze that feels heavier now, more intentional. Maybe I was supposed to lose it, he replies quietly, and the words hang between them, unexpected, layered with something she cannot quite define, and Sophie frowns slightly, not fully understanding but feeling the weight of it anyway. That sounds like something people say after things go wrong, she says, half teasing, half thoughtful, and he smiles faintly, but there is something different in it now, something more serious, or when something goes exactly right. He answers, and for a moment, neither of them speaks, the noise of the cafe fading into the background as the space between them fills with something unspoken, something building, and Sophie looks down at her hands wrapped around the coffee cup, her reflection faintly visible in the dark surface, and she feels it then, the quiet shift, the sense that this moment, this simple, unexpected meeting, is not as ordinary as it should be, even if she cannot yet see why. And outside, the rain begins to slow, the city breathing in that soft, in-between pause, as if holding its breath for what comes next. The pause between them lingers just long enough to feel real, not awkward, not forced, but something quieter, something that settles beneath the surface like a current neither of them can quite name. And Sophie clears her throat softly, glancing toward the window again as the rain slows to a gentle drizzle, the city lights sharpening back into focus. I should probably go, she says, though her voice carries a hesitation that betrays her, because leaving means stepping back into the cold, back into uncertainty, back into a night with no clear place to end. And Ethan notices, of course he does, the way her fingers tighten slightly around the empty cup, the way her eyes flicker just a little too quickly away from his, and he leans forward, resting his forearms lightly on the table, his tone calm but more direct now. Do you have somewhere safe to go tonight? He asks, not intrusive, not demanding, just steady, and Sophie freezes for a fraction of a second, the question landing heavier than she expected, because it cuts past the surface, past the polite conversation, straight into the truth she has been carefully avoiding, and she forces a small shrug, looking down as if the answer might be written somewhere in the faint rings left by her coffee cup. I will figure something out, she says, her voice light, almost dismissive, but it lacks conviction, and Ethan studies her quietly, not pushing, not calling her out, but not accepting the deflection either. And for a moment, he glances down at the wallet again, his thumb brushing along its edge, as if reminding himself of something, and then he reaches inside, pulling out a folded piece of paper, slightly worn, and Sophie notices the movement, curiosity flickering across her face before she can stop it, and he unfolds it slowly, revealing what looks like a printed document with notes scribbled along the margins, numbers, figures, decisions, things that belong to a world far removed from late-night diners and borrowed couches. And for a second, his expression shifts, something conflicted, something heavier, like he is standing at the edge of a decision he has not yet made. And Sophie tilts her head slightly, unable to hold back the question this time. "That looks important," she says quietly, and he lets out a slow breath, his gaze lingering on the page before he looks back at her. "It is," he admits, his voice lower. Now, more honest. "It decides what happens to a lot of people." And Sophie frowns slightly, not fully understanding but sensing the weight behind his words, and she leans back a little, folding her arms loosely as if bracing herself against something she cannot see. "And you are just carrying it around in your pocket?" she asks, a hint of disbelief in her tone, and a faint smile crosses his face, but it does not quite reach his eyes. "I wanted to see what it felt like," he says, almost to himself, and Sophie watches him carefully. Something about the way he says it making her chest tighten, because it sounds less like curiosity and more like someone trying to remember something they lost a long time ago. And she glances down at the paper again, then back at him, and without fully realizing why, she says, "Whatever decision that is. I hope it is not just about numbers." And the moment the words leave her lips, she looks slightly surprised at herself, like she crossed a line she did not mean to cross. But Ethan does not react the way she expects. He does not brush it off or redirect the conversation. Instead, he goes still, completely still, her words landing somewhere deep, somewhere that has been quiet for a long time, and the silence stretches between them again. But this time it feels different, heavier, like something is shifting beneath the surface, and after a few seconds, he folds the paper carefully and places it back inside the wallet. His movements slower now, more deliberate, and when he looks up at her again, there is something new in his expression, something resolved, something decided, though she does not yet know what. And outside, the rain stops completely, leaving the streets washed clean, the city quieter, as if it too is waiting for whatever comes next. The air between them feels different now, quieter but heavier, as if something invisible has shifted and neither of them can step back to where they were before, and Sophie senses it even if she cannot explain it. The way Ethan looks at her now, not just with curiosity, but with something deeper, something that feels almost like recognition, and it makes her uneasy in a way she does not expect. Because people do not usually look at her like that, not strangers, not men who carry themselves the way he does, and she exhales slowly, pushing her chair back just a few inches as if creating a small distance might help her think more clearly. "I really should go," she says again, softer this time, but more certain, because staying any longer feels like stepping into something she cannot control. And she has spent too much of her life learning how to survive by controlling what she can. And Ethan nods this time, not stopping her, not questioning her decision, but as she stands, he reaches into his wallet once more, his movements deliberate, careful, and Sophie watches without meaning to, her curiosity pulling her gaze back despite her intention to leave. And he takes out a small card, plain, minimal, nothing flashy, and holds it out to her. "In case you ever need anything," he says, his tone even. But there is something beneath it, something more intentional than the words suggest. And Sophie hesitates, her eyes flicking from the card to his face, searching for something. Anything that might tell her what this really means, because people say things like that all the time, empty offers, polite gestures that disappear the moment you turn away, and she almost refuses, the instinct rising quickly. But then she remembers the cold outside, the uncertainty waiting just beyond the cafe door, and after a brief pause, she reaches out and takes the card, her fingers brushing his. Again for the briefest moment, and she slips it into the pocket of her jacket without looking at it, like acknowledging it too much might give it power she is not ready to accept. "Thank you," she says quietly, and he nods once, watching her as she adjusts the strap of her backpack and turns toward the door, the bell chiming softly as she steps back out into the night. The air now cooler but clearer after the rain, and for a moment, she just stands there on the sidewalk, letting the city noise wash over her, grounding herself again in something familiar, something predictable, and she tells herself it was just a moment, just a stranger, just a cup of coffee, and nothing more. But as she begins to walk, Her hand instinctively slips into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the edge of the card, and something about it lingers in her mind, something she cannot quite shake. While inside the cafe, Ethan remains seated for a few seconds longer, his gaze fixed on the door long after she has disappeared into the crowd, and then slowly, he stands, pulling out his phone as he walks toward the exit. His expression no longer uncertain, no longer conflicted, but focused, resolved, and as soon as he steps outside, he lifts the phone to his ear, his voice calm but carrying a quiet authority that was nowhere to be found before. "Cancel the restructuring plan," he says, without hesitation, without explanation, and there is a pause on the other end, a moment of confusion that he does not entertain. "No layoffs." He continues, his tone firm. "Final. We are doing this differently." And as he lowers the phone, his eyes drift briefly in the direction Sophie walked, a faint, thoughtful expression crossing his face, as if he is replaying her words, her voice, the simple certainty with which she spoke about things that mattered. And for the first time in a long time, the decision he just made does not feel like a risk. It feels like the only choice that ever made sense. While a few blocks away, Sophie turns a corner and finally slows her pace, her steps lighter than they should be for someone in her situation, and she leans against the wall of a quiet building, letting out a breath she did not realize she was holding. And after a moment, she reaches into her pocket, pulling out the card, her fingers slightly hesitant as she turns it over, her eyes scanning the clean, simple print, and as the words register, her breath catches just slightly, her expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief, because the name on that card is not just a name, it is something she has seen before, something she recognizes from headlines, from stories, from a world that has never once included her. And suddenly, the man from the cafe does not feel like a stranger anymore, and the moment she thought was small begins to feel like something much, much bigger. Sophie stares at the card longer than she should, her fingers tightening slightly around the edges as if the paper itself might suddenly explain everything she is not ready to understand. And the city noise fades into the background again, replaced by the quiet echo of a name she has heard before, not personally, never personally, but in headlines, in conversations drifting through the diner, in the kind of stories that belong to people who live in glass buildings and make decisions that ripple through entire communities. And her breath comes a little slower now, more measured, as she turns the card over once, then again, as if hoping it might change, as if it might become something simpler, something easier to place, but it does not. And for a moment she just stands there, caught between disbelief and something else, something sharper, something closer to frustration, because suddenly the conversation in the cafe feels different in her memory, every word shifting slightly, every pause taking on a new meaning, and she exhales, pushing herself off the wall and slipping the card back into her pocket, her jaw tightening just a little, because she does not know what to do with this information, not yet, and she starts walking again, slower this time, her thoughts louder than the city around her, replaying his voice, his answers, the way he avoided certain questions, the way he listened too closely, and a small part of her feels foolish, not because she trusted him, but because she did not realize who she was talking to, and that thought lingers, uncomfortable, as she makes her way down the street until she reaches the only place still open at this hour that does not ask too many questions, a small all-night diner tucked between a laundromat and a convenience store, the neon sign flickering softly as she pushes the door open and steps inside, the warmth familiar this time, not surprising, not comforting in the same way, just something steady, something predictable, and she moves toward the back booth where she sometimes sits during her breaks, sliding into the seat with a quiet exhale, her reflection faintly visible in the scratched surface of the table, and for a moment she just sits there, staring at her own tired eyes, before reaching into her pocket again, pulling the card out one more time, and this time she says the name under her breath, almost testing it, almost challenging it, and it still feels unreal, still feels disconnected from the man who sat across from her drinking coffee, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and she shakes her head slightly, a faint, almost disbelieving smile touching her lips, because nothing about tonight makes sense anymore, and yet it all happened exactly the way it did. And across the city, in a building that rises far above the streets she walks every day, Ethan steps into a quiet office where the lights are still on despite the late hour, the space sleek and controlled, everything in its place. And as he sets his wallet down on the desk, his gaze lingers on it for a moment longer than necessary, his fingers resting lightly against the leather, as if it now carries something more than what it did before, and his assistant stands a few feet away, waiting, her expression composed but questioning, because the message he sent earlier has already begun to ripple through the company. Decisions paused, plans disrupted, expectations overturned, and she finally speaks, her voice careful. "Are you sure about this?" And Ethan looks up at her, his expression calm but unmistakably certain, the kind of certainty that does not need to be explained. "I am," he says simply, and there is no hesitation, no second thought, because the conversation in that small cafe did something he did not expect. It reminded him of something he had buried beneath numbers and strategies and outcomes. Something simple, something clear, and as he moves to the window, looking out over the city stretching endlessly below, his reflection faint in the glass, he thinks of the way Sophie said it. Not yours, not mine, just right and wrong. And for the first time in a long time, the line between those things does not feel complicated anymore. It feels obvious. And somewhere far below, Sophie folds the card carefully and slips it back into her pocket once more, but this time she does not hide it from herself. This time she keeps it close, because whether she wants to admit it or not, that small piece of paper has already changed something, and she knows, deep down, that this is not the end of the story, it is only the moment everything begins to shift. Sophie does not sleep that night. Not really. Even after the diner quiets down and the last of the late customers drift out into the early morning chill, leaving behind half-empty coffee cups and the faint echo of conversations that no longer matter, she remains in that same booth, her sketchbook open in front of her but untouched, her pencil resting between her fingers as her thoughts circle back to the same moment again and again. The rain, the wallet, his voice, and most of all, the name on that card. And every time she closes her eyes, she sees it again, clear and undeniable, and it does not fit. It does not match the man who sat across from her speaking in quiet tones and careful answers. And that contradiction unsettles her more than anything else, because it means one of two things. Either she completely misjudged him, or he chose not to be fully honest with her, and neither option sits well. And by the time the first light of morning begins to filter through the windows, casting a pale glow across the empty tables, Sophie makes a decision, not dramatic, not loud, but firm in the way that matters. She is not going to let this remain a question. She needs to understand what really happened, and a few hours later, after washing up in the diner restroom and pulling her hair back into something more presentable, she stands across the street from a building she has only ever seen from a distance, tall, sleek, the kind of place where everything feels intentional, where people walk with purpose and security guards stand near the entrance with quiet authority. And Sophie hesitates at the curb, her fingers brushing against the card in her pocket, her heart beating just a little faster than it should, because stepping inside means crossing a line she has never crossed before, a line between her world and his. And for a moment she considers turning back, telling herself that none of this matters, that she can just move on and forget it ever happened. But then she remembers the way he looked at her when she handed him the wallet, the way he said maybe I was supposed to lose it, and something inside her refuses to let that go. And before she can overthink it, she steps forward, crossing the street and pushing through the glass doors into a lobby that feels like a different world entirely, the air cool and quiet, the floors polished to a shine that reflects the ceiling lights above, and she slows her steps instinctively, suddenly aware of every detail about herself that does not belong in a place like this. Her worn shoes, her simple clothes, the backpack slung over her shoulder, and for a brief second, she almost laughs at the absurdity of it. What am I even doing here? But then she walks up to the front desk, her voice steady despite everything. I am here to see Ethan Blake, she says, placing the card gently on the counter, and the receptionist glances at it, then at her, her expression shifting ever so slightly, not dismissive, not rude, but clearly surprised, and Sophie braces herself for the polite rejection she has come to expect in situations like this, the kind that comes wrapped in professionalism but leaves no room for argument. But instead, the receptionist straightens, her tone changing as she picks up the phone, speaking quietly into it. And within moments, Sophie finds herself being asked to wait, and that alone is enough to make her heart race. Because it means this is real, all of it, and somewhere upstairs, far removed from the lobby where she now stands. Ethan looks up from his desk as his assistant steps in, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes carrying a hint of curiosity. "There is someone here to see you," she says, placing a familiar card on his desk, and the moment he sees it, something shifts in his expression, something immediate and unmistakable, and when she adds, "Her name is Sophie," there is no hesitation, no question, just a quiet certainty as he stands, already moving toward the door, because some moments, once they begin, are not meant to be left unfinished. Sophie stands there in the center of the lobby, every second stretching just a little longer than it should, her eyes drifting across the polished floors and tall glass walls as people move around her with quiet confidence, each of them belonging in a way she does not, and she becomes painfully aware of the contrast again, the invisible line she crossed just by walking through those doors, and for a brief moment, doubt creeps in, sharp and familiar. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe she misunderstood everything. Maybe the man she met in that small cafe is not the same man who works here. Not really. And she shifts her weight slightly, her fingers brushing against the strap of her backpack as she considers turning around, leaving before she is told she does not belong. But before that thought can fully take shape, she hears it, her name, Sophie, spoken clearly, unmistakably, and she turns instinctively, her breath catching just slightly as she sees him walking toward her, not from the entrance, not from the street, but from deeper inside the building, moving with a kind of quiet authority that feels completely different from the man she met the night before, and yet somehow exactly the same, and everything about him fits now. The way people subtly step aside as he passes, the way the receptionist straightens just a little more, the way the space itself seems to shift around him, and Sophie feels it all at once, the reality of it settling in, heavy and undeniable, and for a second, she just stands there, unsure of what to say, unsure of what she expected this moment to be, and when he stops in front of her, close enough now that she can see the same calm expression, the same steady eyes, she lets out a small breath she did not realize she was holding. "You could have told me," she says, her voice quieter than she intended, not angry, not accusing, but carrying a trace of something else, something like disappointment, and Ethan does not interrupt, does not defend himself right away. He simply listens, giving her the space to say what she needs to say, and she shakes her head, slightly, glancing down for a moment before looking back at him. "You let me think you were just normal," she adds, and the word lingers, not as an insult, but as something she is trying to understand, and Ethan nods slowly, acknowledging it without dismissing it. "I am," he says calmly, and Sophie lets out a soft, almost incredulous breath, a faint smile touching her lips despite herself. "People like you do not sit in random cafes and lose their wallets," she replies, and there is a quiet honesty in her tone that makes the moment feel more real than any formal conversation ever could, and for a second, Ethan's expression softens, just slightly. "Sometimes we do," he says, his voice steady, "especially when we need to remember something." And Sophie studies him carefully, trying to decide if that is an answer or another way of avoiding one, and she reaches into her pocket, pulling out the card and holding it between her fingers. "This is not something small, Ethan," she says, her voice more grounded now, more certain. "This is not just a name." And he looks at the card briefly, then back at her, his gaze steady, unshaken. "I know," he replies, and there is no arrogance in it, no pride, just a simple acknowledgement of truth, and that, more than anything, disarms her, because she expected distance, expected something cold or calculated, but instead she finds something else, something real, and the tension in her shoulders eases just slightly, though the questions remain, and she tilts her head, her eyes narrowing just a fraction as she asks the one thing that has been sitting in her mind since last night. "Why did you not say anything?" And this time, Ethan does not answer immediately, his gaze shifting for just a moment as if choosing his words carefully, not because he does not have an answer, but because he wants to give the right one. And when he finally speaks, his voice is quieter, more honest than before. Because for a few minutes, you were not talking to a title, he says, you were talking to me. And the simplicity of it lands deeper than she expects, cutting through the confusion, through the assumptions, straight into something she cannot easily dismiss. And for a moment, neither of them moves, the space between them no longer divided by status or distance, but filled with something quieter, something more human. And as Sophie looks at him, really looks this time, she realizes that the man from the cafe did not disappear. He is still here, standing right in front of her. And maybe, just maybe, that matters more than everything else she thought she knew. For a moment, the noise of the lobby fades into something distant, like it no longer matters, and Sophie feels the weight of his words settle in, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady, like something true that does not need to prove itself. And she exhales slowly, her shoulders relaxing just a little as she studies him again, this time without the filter of assumptions, without the quiet barrier she built the moment she realized who he was. And she nods once, almost to herself, as if acknowledging something she cannot fully explain yet. I did, she says softly. I talked to you. And the words hang there, simple but meaningful, and Ethan's expression shifts just slightly, not into a smile, not into anything obvious, but into something quieter, something that feels like relief. And for a second, neither of them speaks, the moment stretching in a way that does not feel uncomfortable, just real. And then Sophie glances around the lobby, at the people moving with purpose, at the space that clearly belongs to him in ways it never could to her, and she lets out a small breath, a faint smile touching her lips. This is your world, she says, not as a question, but as a statement, and Ethan follows her gaze briefly before looking back at her. It is part of it, he replies, and there is something important in the way he says that, something that leaves room for more, and Sophie tilts her head slightly, considering that, before her expression softens just a little. Last night, you said that wallet mattered, she says, her voice more thoughtful now, that it decided what happened to a lot of people. And Ethan nods slowly, his gaze steady. It did, he answers, and there is no hesitation, no attempt to downplay it. And Sophie studies him for a moment longer before asking, and now? And this time, when he responds, there is a quiet certainty in his voice that was not there before. Now it does something different, he says, and Sophie feels something shift. Again, subtle but real, because she understands what he is not saying, understands that the decision changed, that something in that moment in the cafe, in that simple act of returning something that was never hers, had more impact than she could have imagined. And she looks down at the card still in her hand, turning it lightly between her fingers before slipping it back into her pocket. But this time, it does not feel like a symbol of distance. It feels like a connection, something unexpected, but real. And she meets his eyes again, her expression steady, grounded. You did not have to change anything because of me, she says, not rejecting it, but making sure it is understood. And Ethan shakes his head slightly, a faint, almost thoughtful smile appearing. I did not change it because of you, he replies. I changed it because you reminded me of something I already knew. And the honesty in that answer lands deeper than anything else he could have said, because it does not place the weight on her. It does not turn her into something she is not. It simply acknowledges the truth, and Sophie nods slowly, accepting that. And for the first time since she walked into the building, the tension she carried begins to fade, replaced by something quieter, something more certain, and she takes a small step back, adjusting the strap of her backpack again. But this time it is not about leaving. It is about choosing what comes next. And Ethan watches her, not stopping her, not guiding her, just present, just there. And after a brief pause, she smiles, small but genuine. You still owe me a better answer about what you actually do, she says, a hint of lightness returning to her tone, and Ethan lets out a soft breath that almost resembles a laugh, the tension easing just enough to make room for something new. Then I guess I owe you another coffee, he replies, and Sophie considers that for a second, the corners of her lips lifting just slightly. Maybe, she says, her voice calm but open, and in that single word, there is possibility, not guaranteed, not forced, but real. And as she turns toward the doors, the sunlight now filtering through the glass, brighter than it was before. She pauses for just a moment, glancing back at him. And there is no hesitation this time, no confusion, just clarity. Because whatever this is, whatever it becomes, it started with something simple, something honest, and that is enough. And as she steps out into the city again, the world feels the same and completely different all at once. While inside, Ethan remains where he is for a moment longer, watching the door close behind her, and for the first time in a long time, the decisions waiting on his desk, the numbers, the strategies, all of it feels less like a weight and more like something he can shape with intention. Because sometimes it only takes one moment, one choice, one person to remind you that what matters most was never the numbers at all.